I am so bummed that I can't be there with you all in person today, but I am so grateful and honored to be a part of this really important exhibition. And I have just been really impressed by all of the work from art to literature to, you know, social sciences like me. And everything in between. So I'm very happy to be here. Today, I will be talking about the gendering of toys and clothing, how it happened, and why it matters. So I am Dr. Megan Maas, and I am an assistant professor in human development and family studies at Michigan State University. If you want to get in contact with me, my Twitter and Facebook handle are at Megan K. Maas, and my email is right there on the screen, maasmeg1 at msu.edu. I tend to post a lot of gender, culture, sexual, health and society kinds of pieces on my social media accounts. And I'm very happy to share resources, references from this talk, articles, really anything via email as well. So don't hesitate to reach out. Okay, so we are going to talk all about from gendered toys to gendered behavior. And I know it seems like a bit of a stretch, but I'll be connecting some dots for you all. And first, we're going to sort of discuss, or I'm going to talk about why I'm even here or virtually here with you, and what spurred some of this work in the recent sort of introduction to more gender neutral toys, or the purposeful marketing, perhaps, of gender neutral toys. So, what are these things and why do we want them? I'll then discuss how we got the pink girls and the blue boys. So, how did toys become gendered in the first place? Then we'll be going into how children sort of use toys and clothing to explore their identities and their possibilities. And then lastly, I'll be discussing how playing with toys and expressing ourselves through clothing is part of our practice, playing out gender roles and relationship relationship roles in later life, early adulthood, adolescence, and how some of this might culminate into what we're seeing in terms of sexual violence, relationship violence, things like that. So I'll start off with this quote. It is one of my favorites of all time. We're born naked. Everything else is drag. This is from RuPaul, who's arguably like the most popular, famous drag queen. If you don't watch the Drag Race, I suggest you do. It's a lot of fun, and basically he, will talk about, when he explains this quote, is that all of the clothing we wear is a form of drag because it is all performative. Even if some is more socially acceptable, some dress is more socially acceptable than others, it's all conveying or expressing who we are. And that particular sort of way that we do what we do through dress can be thought of as a type of performance. And so it might not be as outrageous as a drag queen's hair and makeup, but it still is conveying a message. Okay, so gender neutral toys. What are they? Why do we want them? In 2019, I was asked to write a piece for The Conversation, which is an online publication that academics write, pieces on different hot topics and explain research in ways that others might understand who are not in academia. And so when I was asked to write about the gender neutral doll that was coming out, that Mattel was releasing, called the Humanoid, I was a little surprised but intrigued, because goes along with some of my work on gender and sexual socialization. But basically, Mattel came out with this line of humanoid dolls that had a range of skin tones, hair color, and textures, which is awesome. They all have the same shape, size, body, so that can't vary, which has its pros and its cons, right? It's androgynous, so that's a pro. Is it representative of adolescent bodies? If these are supposed to be adolescents, then probably not. But it's marketed as the genderless doll because the wigs are interchangeable. So the doll itself is actually bald and comes with different wigs. And so based on the clothing and hairstyles, you can express gender in many different ways. So people had some very big reactions when this came out. And some of the more negative reactions were coming from the conservative right, like this is some sort of, social decay or perversion of our idea of gender. Whereas on the left, there was this sort of appreciation for the toy, but a little bit of pushback and criticism that it doesn't go far enough in really pushing our ideas of gender. And so even though the dolls themselves don't necessarily do a lot for transgender or gender diverse folks, they do go miles. They're kicking that ball, way down the field in terms of showing that gender expression takes many different forms, and the doll can manifest that in many different ways. But I was really wondering when I was going to the research for this, can a doll or any of these sort of growing list of gender neutral toys or advertising really change the way we think about gender? So, for example, Mattel says that it's simply just responding to how our views of gender have changed. So, with their market research saying, kids don't want their toys dictated by gender norms, that makes a lot of sense. And it certainly makes business sense, given that almost a quarter of adolescents who are reporting that they don't necessarily feel like they are cisgender, or which is the being identifying as the same gender you're assigned at birth, or heterosexual. They're really open to using terminology earlier on, such as non-binary or bisexual. And so having toys that would reflect those changes in identity makes a lot of sense. As a developmental psychologist and someone who researches gender and sexual socialization, I also am here to tell you that it makes some scientific sense. So, uh, gender is an identity, right? It's beyond what we are assigned at birth, or what our biological sex is. So, biological sex is determined by chromosomes and appearance of genitalia. So, chromosomes, XY meaning male, XX meaning female, but there's also other variations in chromosomes, like an X where the second X is either missing or it's damaged. That's going to change the way the body appears, or having two X's and a Y. That'll change how the body appears. But then there's also various different genes that are involved in hormone receptivity in utero. And so you might be XY, but have a couple of different, they're called disorders, but really they're just variations in how people develop. And you might not be able to receive the testosterone that's circulating, or even just like have the testosterone turn into something that the androgens can actually do something with. So for example, you can think about it as just like the testosterone's there and it's floating, but it's not being received. And so male genitalia isn't growing. So we all start off undifferentiated. I'm sure you've probably heard that we all start off as girls or females. That's not really true, but we all start out with undifferentiated internal and external genitalia, and that can look a little bit more female. And so when you have a testosterone insensitivity issue, then you also don't have a penis that develops, but you have an XY chromosome. So anyway, getting into the weeds a little bit with that, but it's just to say that we have so many different variations in gender, but we also have variations in biological sex that really make the whole pink and blue thing obsolete. Unfortunately, though, I really do think that although it's great news that there is a doll where some children will better be able to see themselves reflected in their play with this doll, the doll alone is not going to overturn decades of socialization that have led us to believe that boys wear blue, they have short hair, and they play with trucks, whereas girls wear and love pink, they grow their hair long, and they play with dolls. These ideas are really ingrained in our society. And more to the point, it's really not going to change how we teach boys that masculinity is a really good thing, being tough and strong and all of those attributes of masculinity, and that femininity is something less than that. It's something to be devalued or disrespected. And these are views that my research and many other researchers show is associated with sexual violence attitudes and behaviors. Okay, so pink girls, blue boys. How did we get here? The kinds of toys that American children play with tend to adhere to these really clear gender binary. And usually this binary is marked by the colors pink and blue. But meaning that toys and clothing that are marketed to boys are blue, but they also tend to be more aggressive and involve action and excitement, whereas girl toys are usually pink, and they tend to be toys where you play with them sort of passively. They emphasize beauty, like with the princess thing, or nurturing with the baby doll kind of thing. But it wasn't always like this. So around the turn of like the 20th century, toys were rarely marketed to different genders. They were just children's toys. And but by the 1940s, as we have the ramp up of the Industrial Revolution, and we have a lot of product being marketed, we have sort of not the emergence of advertising, but the acceleration of advertising as its own sort of business. And so what happened is that these advertising companies and execs at advertising companies quickly learned that wealthier families who had more expendable money, they would not just buy a crib, clothes, dolls, toys, things like that. They would buy another set of those items if they had a, another gendered baby. So if they started out with a girl and then they had a boy, if there were boy toys and clothing available to them to purchase, they would go for that. And so the marketing sort of emerged that way as a way to get wealthier parents to buy two sets of everything. And so this is where this idea of, pink is for girls, blue is for boys was born. So as you can imagine, toys from the 19th century were really lackluster. So we're talking beige and wood. No real colors in many of these examples. The picture on the bottom is a popular rolling horse, kind of akin to a rocking horse. And then the baby dolls, they were all very plain and somewhat gender neutral because remember at the time, or maybe you don't remember, but at the time, so we haven't talked about it yet, babies typically all wore white dresses, regardless of their age. And that continued till around 2 or 3 years old. And white, cream, that kind of thing. So that's what babies wear. And that's what the baby dolls reflected. Where in the 20s to 40s, really more like the 30s, these two toys in particular, really more 30s, some emergence in the 20s, were the Raggedy Ann doll. So now we're seeing a little bit more color. And then the pedal push car. So this was both in sort of life-size versions for little kids, like mini cars, or actual toy cars, very small cars. And these toys were really two of the first toys that were actually advertised to people. In the 50s and 60s, we see this idea of the action figure and the doll, but a new kind of a doll. Instead of a baby doll, it's going to be an adult doll that does certain things. But given that it was the 1950s and 60s, we see the gender roles really reflected in these dolls. So we've got Barbie's really feminine. She was launched in 1959. G.I. Joe was really masculine, obviously, also released around then. And this really reflected those post-World War II gender roles that went alongside with the baby boom. So as soldiers came back from war, they were really, heavily marketed to get back to work and women to get back home. Because remember, women had during the war went to work in the industries and manufacturing because there were just not enough workers. And so with this, we see the pendulum swinging the other direction as being more progressive, again, with toys that are more gender neutral. So we're seeing primary colors, and Mrs. Potato Head on the bottom there, you can tell it's a girl because she's wearing the skirt. But other than that, it's pretty gender neutral-ish. Obviously, this Lego commercial with a little girl playing with Legos, but she's dressed in jeans. It's not, like the girly Lego Friends sets that we have today. And unfortunately, I don't have a picture of it, but if you can just Google like modern Mr. and Mrs. Potato Head and see just how drastically gendered they've become. So what happened then, and what we're seeing more of now, is in the 1990s, there was a major deregulation of advertising. So there used to be lots of rules and regulations about advertising to kids, particularly when it came to toys and food. And a lot of those regulations were rolled back. And so children in the 90s were in early 2000s were sort of faced an avalanche of new advertising, more commercials. The commercial breaks were longer, and different. They could use different advertising techniques in terms of jingles and things like that that they weren't allowed to use before when those regulations were upheld. So the other thing that really changed is that from this sort of like boys and girls, whoever, everybody loves Legos, kind of situation in the 70s to super princess time in the late 90s and early 2000s. A lot of this has been attributed to the Disney CEO change with Michael Eisner. So when Michael Eisner became CEO of Disney, and Walt Disney had died, there were some changes that were made. Lots of changes, but one of the changes was this combination of the princesses. So Walt Disney always wanted there to be the classic Disney stories and princesses, of course, but he never wanted the characters to combine into any kind of joint endeavor. He was really big on keeping them separate. And but when he died, obviously that sort of went away. And there were some marketing execs that said, some of the older Disney princesses ratings are going down. How are we going to get people to be more enthralled with the Disney princesses? And so they started marketing them together. So that's where you're seeing the Disney princesses together on a lunchbox or a sleeping bag or a t-shirt, where you're seeing them together with pink and purple and sparkles and heavily marketed to girls, like this is the ultimate girls toy. And in a similar vein, there were the same kind of advertising techniques using similar, evidence-based data, did similar changes with superheroes. So when DC and Marvel empires really started to grow with the popularity of, new releases and re-releases of some of the classic superhero stories out of comic books, the toys were then re-released. And as you can see in this image, the toy on the left-hand side is from the late 1960s, not necessarily emphasizes muscles, whereas Batman of the early 2000s is really ripped, right? And you can also see some of this evolution, although I don't have pictures of it. You can see some of this evolution changing in the Batman Halloween costumes, because now they have built-in muscles in those Halloween costumes for boys, and before they didn't. They would be like the cape and like a little bat logo, and that's kind of it. So research shows that we are, with these sort of ebbs and flows with toys, where we're at right now is we tend to be more accepting, parents in particular. So these are parents who are surveyed. They tend to be more accepting of their girls playing with traditionally, more boy masculine stuff. So like the trucks, the cars, um, Legos, and even the toy guns like Nerf guns. It's more popular and socially accepted. Parents are more likely to purchase those kinds of things for daughters. However, when it comes to boys, there is less acceptance of, boys playing with traditionally girly stuff like baby dolls, Barbies, princesses, those kinds of things. And so parents tend to not purchase those toys for their boys, and they feel weird about other people doing that as well. Okay, so why does this really matter? So I'll get to why, the toys in conjunction with the clothing are really strong socializers when it comes to gender socialization. And part of this is because we are practicing who we think we are and practicing who we want to be when we're little kids and we're playing. And so the toys really help us imagine like who we are and what we could be, whereas the clothing really helps us express who we want that to be to others. So we get to decide, how do we want others to see us through our clothing? And it used to be relatively simple. So I mentioned before that all babies wore dresses until 2 or 3 years old. They were white, didn't matter the gender. This was for practical reasons, like changing diapers, or just a lot easier to do that with dresses. Babies' clothing was boiled a lot because it was, dirty more often or needing to be cleaned more often, due to urine and feces and that kind of, and, vomit and things like that, right? Babies' clothing needs to be washed a lot more often than adult clothing. So babies tended, just for practicality's sake, wear white dresses. And so um, there was no gendered separation there. Now, like I said, with the sort of emergence of advertising and color printing, so color advertising in newspapers and things like that, there was then the opportunity to show the color differences, right? So before color printing was cheap and affordable and everything was advertised in newspapers, it didn't matter what color it was because there was no color. It was all just black and white. So here's a couple examples of clothing from the 50s where we see that there's certainly an emphasis now on boys wearing pants instead of dresses, girls still wearing dresses. And we see that diversion, but we're really not seeing the pink and the blue, right? So again, that pendulum swing back the other way. We see the 70s kind of backlash of girls now wearing pants and bell bottoms, sort of bell bottoms for all kind of a thing. Now, flash forward to today, I could show you hundreds of examples of gendered clothing, but the best example is definitely Halloween costumes. So with Halloween costumes over time have changed quite a bit. They didn't used to be as gendered as they are now, but now they're a really great sociocultural representation of how we socialize boys to be actors or people who get things done, and girls to be objects to be admired and thought of as beautiful. So, for example, here's the police officer costume. Female police officers don't wear dresses. They wear the same uniform that male police officers wear. Here's Cookie Monster. looking like Cookie Monster for the toddler. The girl looks nothing like Cookie Monster. She's just wearing a Cookie Monster dress. Flash forward to a more promiscuous version of Nemo, the fish from Finding Nemo. It's so promiscuous, she doesn't even resemble a fish, let alone someone who's wearing a dress. But one of the things I talk about with my kids is if you ask yourself when you're looking at the costume, does this thing actually wear a dress? Does Cookie Monster wear a dress? If the answer is no, then that costume is not for you because it's been marketed to make you fit the mold of being the pretty or unfortunately sexy as a child version of whatever it is you want to be. Now, there is some research that's been done on the clothing differences between boys and girls. You could see, we're having less material, we're showing more body on the female intended costumes, but it's the same for clothing. So there is literally less of the clothing for the same thing that is marketed to both genders. So for example, on the right is an example of Cat and Jack, which is a Target brand shorts. The ones on top are marketed to girls. The ones on the bottom are marketed to boys. On the left-hand side, you see the exact same shorts, right? They're even the same style. It's the same brand sold at Target at the same time. The girls' shorts are a lot smaller. So some of this research that's been done is attributing this difference in what we call like taking up space. So when we're socialized, and girls and women are socialized to be smaller, to be passive, to physically be thinner, to be quieter, to literally take up less space. So there's less clothing for you to cover up because the intention is that you are smaller and that you are to be small or appear smaller. The other way that this is done is through the lens of the pink tax. And the pink tax is really this idea that emerged when studying the cost of various different products that are marketed differentially to men and women, but arbitrarily, that, products that don't need to be gendered. Like Bic actually came out with a pen, like a pen that you write with for women. So most of this work is done looking at razors. Razors marketed to women tend to be more expensive than razors marketed to men, even though they can be made of the exact same material and coming from the exact same brand. And deodorant that's marketed to men versus women, kind of a thing. So that's what's known as the pink tax. But with girls' clothing, this has also been applied where girls' clothing tends to be slightly more expensive than boys, and it contains a lot less fabric. So it doesn't make sense that it would be more expensive. So it's sort of like this extra tax or extra burden that we might pay as girls and women in society. So taken together, the toys and the clothes are really socializing girls to be passive, not taking charge of their lives, their destinies, their careers, really focusing on emotional traits like being nurturing, caretaking, even when it's not taking care of babies or the home. It's a lot of the girls' toys are about like taking care of pets, and other caretaking endeavors, or to be objects, to be princesses, or to be pretty Cookie Monsters instead of regular Cookie Monster, so that they can be observed and respected for how they look physically, and how, instead of what they're actually doing or contributing to the world, because it's so focused on that caretaking and beauty. And unfortunately, this doesn't bode well. So girls in general are taught from a very young age that their bodies are the most important things about themselves. And this aspect is solidified with the princesses. Most of the Disney princesses don't do a whole lot. The more modern ones do a lot more, but the classic ones don't do very much, but they're gorgeous. And the whole, everyone throughout the land knows how gorgeous and special they are. And that's where a lot of their power comes from, is in their looks. And so they also learn that they're supposed to seek this male attention and approval and then just keep changing themselves as needed. And then lastly, as they get a little bit older and heading toward middle school and high school, they're faced with this conundrum of being pretty like a princess and maybe sexy like a princess can be sometimes, or like some older women can be, but not slutty. Almost impossible to pull that off, by the way. Okay, and taken together for boys, right, because this is all socialized on a binary, even though there are kids that don't identify as boys or girls, they're not marketed to with the clothing and the toys. But taken together, boys are then socialized to be aggressive because they're playing with guns, they're playing with action figure toys that are superheroes who are doing violent things or being really strong, or they're instrumental traits like construction workers, tractors, building things like, engineers would do that kind of thing. But it's all about taking action. The toys that they're using are active. They're taking action on something else versus things being done to them. Like what happens with Barbies that just don't do anything, or only focus on how they look, or the princess stuff, right? And so boys tend to be socialized to have more instrumental traits like being strong, skilled, successful, confident, leading, and those tend to be healthier traits. Those are some of the more healthier traits. Some of the more unhealthy traits would be violence and that kind of thing, because that's when it really is manifesting in the most extreme way. It would lead toward violence, right? So in a recent analysis of Lego sets, they found that there was this dichotomy in what the Lego sets emphasized. So the ones that were marketed to boys had more pieces, per set, and they tended to be more skilled or showcase more skilled professions. They were doing more things compared to the girls' Lego sets tended to have less pieces for the same age group. And they tended to focus on things like, friendships, being pretty, and caring for babies and animals. Kind of similar to the Disney princesses, right? And so unfortunately, boys then are taught from a very young age that they must be really tough. And if they can't prove that they're tough by just being who they are, they have to prove it by other means, such as violence. However, this is also about seeking male approval, right? Because we're valuing masculinity more than femininity. And boys then in themselves have to keep changing themselves as well in order to be accepted by other male peers or male superiors. And so there's a lot of pressure to be tough, to be smart, to be rich. It's hard because those are really difficult things to attain, but in ways it can be better because they're imagining ways to get there and things that they can do to get there. versus thinking of different things that you can do to your body to make it so others perceive your body in a more positive way. Okay, so toys are used for identity exploration. That's the reason why they're so important. Research shows that children use toys to think about who they are. Who am I? Am I like this toy? Am I like that toy? What group am I in? Am I like these princesses with this kind of hair and this skin tone? Or am I like this princess with that skin tone and that hair? What toys look like me? What am I supposed to do with my life? How do princesses behave? Or how does this Barbie do this thing versus this dinosaur do this thing? Do construction workers do these other things? What do teachers do? Is it more about caretaking for kids? What's it possible for me to do? Is this Barbie going to be an astronaut? You know, that kind of thing. So children do use toys to explore their identities. And they use toys to think about their careers. So this is sort of the next step. So there was a study done where they randomly assigned two groups of girls, so they're different backgrounds and socioeconomic status, ethnicity, things like that were randomly assigned to different groups. And one group was given Barbies to play with in the waiting room before they took the study. And the other group was given Legos to play with in the waiting room before they took the study because they didn't know that playing with the toys was part of the study. Now, the group that was randomly assigned to Barbies, they were less likely to imagine themselves in scientific positions like being an astronaut or an engineer or a physician, that kind of thing. Whereas the girls that played with the Legos before they participated in the study, they were more likely to say they could imagine themselves in scientific positions, astronaut, engineer, that type of thing. In a similar study, they randomly assigned young women, so college women, to either try on a bathing suit in a dressing room before taking the study. So they didn't know this was part of the study. Well, they had to have known it was part of the study because they're going into a dressing room. But because they're randomly assigned, everybody should know it's part of the study. So that variable in and of itself should be sort of controlled for. Whereas the other group put on a sweater before they engaged in their before they engaged in the study, in the actual study participation. And the group that tried on the bathing suits first, they were less likely to imagine themselves making six figures or more, or having a scientific kind of a job where, they're doing more math, engineering, chemistry, that kind of thing. But they also were higher in anxiety. So they scored higher in anxiety. Whereas the group with the sweater, they were more likely to imagine themselves making six figures or working in the scientific area, and they were lower in anxiety. So this is an example of what we call self-objectification in the literature, where what you wear then makes you think about yourself differently because it's how you're portraying yourself to the outside world. Okay, so how does this culminate in romantic experiences? So, like I said before, the toys are about exploration. They're about like our identity exploration, imagining who we are, what we can be. The clothing is about exploring how we express who we are to others, how we might want to influence how other people see us, how we might want to have an impact on other people, whether that be a small impact or a large impact, like a drag queen would have on somebody. The other thing is that because we're playing and practicing those roles throughout childhood, by the time we're ready for romantic relationships, we've already played those gender roles a lot. And so this results in what has called the sexual double standard. So this is where um, men are socialized to be powerful actors who do things, and women are socialized to be passive objects who are subordinate, who have things done to them. They're rescued by the prince, right? They don't rescue the prince. Um, they're beautiful and somebody can choose them, but they're not going out and doing the stuff and doing the choosing. And even in cases of sexual assault, like actual sexual violence or attitudes towards sexual violence, research shows that people tend to blame rape victims more for what happened to them if they step outside the gender lines and gender roles, such as, cheating on a spouse or something like that, because that's not consistent with like the pure passive female role. She's thought to then have brought it on herself, kind of a thing. There was another study that found that adolescents who really subscribe to traditional masculine gender roles, they tend to be more likely to engage in dating violence and have more positive or accepting attitudes of sexual assault or physical and emotional abuse. And so there's something about that really I not just identifying, but really glorifying those masculine traits that might be indicators of, or that are indicators of sexual violent attitudes and behaviors. Okay, so I'm not going to go too much into media, but just to say that when we are playing with these toys, the toys tend to represent our favorite movies. So it used to be that when kids imagined being princesses and superheroes and firefighters and construction workers, that they imagined what that would be like. Now we know that kids, when they play those roles, they're sort of playing the characters like Bob the Builder, or they're playing, characters from Dinosaur Train, or they're playing, princesses specifically from Frozen. And so we really need to know the media that are accompanying the toys in imaginative play and what the media are portraying. So in the sexual media practice model, it just kind of shows that you have your identity, how you see yourself. Then you're going to select your media. So perhaps you're seeing yourself as a girly girl. So you're going to select more princess, girly girl stuff. Or you see yourself as a really tough boy. So you're going to pick more tough boy stuff. But then depending on how you engage with the media and how you apply it to your real life, that may or may not be related to how you then change how you think about yourself or confirm how you think about yourself. But one of the ways that this gender binary manifests in media, and particularly Disney princess stuff, is in what we call the virgin beast trope. And it's this idea of the young virginal female with the older aggressive male sort of dichotomy in that we see that's really consistent across fictional heterosexual relationships in romantic fiction. So the first tale of Beauty and the Beast was really found in 1740, and it was a fairy tale, and like all fairy tales had some sort of moral that they were trying to teach children. And in this case, the moral was for females, for girls to remain pure, and for them to play a role in sort of grooming or taming the boys or the unruly males. And this heterosexual narrative really dismisses male aggression. So it sort of perpetuates this idea that male aggression is just inevitable. But it also romanticizes the endurance of aggression. So the best example of this is in Beauty and the Beast. So she's an iconic Disney princess. Little girls love her. I loved her when I was a little girl. Um, and my poor daughters, they have to hear a lot of commentary whenever we watched Beauty and the Beast or seen and played with, Belle type toys. But essentially, Belle is sacrificing herself in exchange for her father's freedom. Um, Beast is controlling how she dresses. He's commanding how and when she eats. He's using his power to threaten her. He says, if you will join me for dinner, this is not a request. If she doesn't eat with me, then she doesn't eat at all. He threatens to break down the door because he's trying to intimidate her to come out of the room. He breaks things to intimidate her. And the message to her is just wait it out. He's got a good heart. Eventually, it'll all work out. Just stay pretty and cute and quiet. But she suffers harm because of this. So she's separated from her family. She loses her identity. She wants to be an inventor like her father. And she's reading about, she got her head in a book, always reading about new things. But she's also depicted as just being in constant fear of Beast. She's never really quite feeling comfortable with herself and the world around her. And this kind of harm is part of the normalization of just violence toward girls and women. And another really prominent part of the normalization of violence against girls and women is this blurring the lines between what's a woman and what's a little girl. And so we see this in two different ways. So one is where adult women are dressed to look like children, little girls, and little girls are dressed to look like adult women. And what we know is that when we see these types of images in the research, so they can randomly assign to use to see these images or to see some other type of neutral image, when participants see these images that sexualize young girls, they are more likely to agree with sexual abuse myths, such as it's normal for men to be attracted to prepubescent girls, or that if a sexual violation like molestation or assault occurs with a minor adolescent, then she probably played a role in it. And so if we see these kinds of images everywhere, they might what that research suggests is that it might be contributing to some of this low level ambivalence when it comes to child sexual abuse or sexual violence against girls and women. And what happens is, even though we see those images everywhere and we might think, oh, that's terrible or what have you, the truth of the matter is we tend to socialize and reward girls who engage in this kind of behavior. We tend to, as parents, reward girls for being pretty and doing that kind of a role. Well, unfortunately, what happens is because we are not passive consumers of media anymore, we are active contributors to it. when I was a kid, I could see the Disney princesses and, the sexy pageant girls, but I couldn't do really anything about it. I couldn't make that a part of who I was and a part of how I expressed myself to the world. Whereas now, teenagers can see it in these types of media that they consume, but then they can do it, they can be it in their social media profiles online. And these profiles are totally gendered image based. The masculine stuff is about showing how strong you are, your muscles, how big you are. The feminine, profiles are all about showing different body parts and showing like how gorgeous you are. So for example, Kim Kardashian is a great example of like the body, whereas Taylor Swift is a great example of being pretty and likable. Now, if you bring this up with your kids, teenagers today are going to tell you that Kim Kardashian and Taylor Swift are old ladies, but they are sort of like the OG or the first ones, who really curated their Instagram profiles. And so now people feel like they need to show these specific body parts to prove how sexy and hot they are, right? And they know how to do it because they've been practicing it since they were little kids, playing with Barbies and princesses and that sort of thing. And boys know how to be tough and be aggressive and be violent because they've been playing with aggressive, violent toys that are expressing that type of toughness and anger. But in contrast to that, there are bystander intervention programs like Coaching Boys into Men and the Bystander Intervention Playbook that are evidence-based for reducing these harmful gender norms and attitudes among high school students. And it also helps sort of engage some of those healthier aspects of masculinity, like leadership and protection in, changing some of the environments at school instead of relying on those more unhealthy traits of masculinity, like violence and aggression. So, in conclusion, Mattel's gender-neutral dolls offer this really much-needed variety in kids' toys, but children, as well as their parents, also need to learn more tolerance of how others express their gender. And in particular, boys really need support in appreciating and practicing more traditional feminine traits like communicating emotion or caring for somebody else. These are all skills that are required for any healthy relationship, that are required for any parental relationship. So gender neutrality represents the absence of gender. It's not the tolerance of gender expression. We need a tolerance and a celebration of different gender expressions in order to really chip away at some of these harmful gender roles that we have that are contributing to relationship violence and gender-based violence. Because if we just focus on the absence of gender, or sort of getting rid of gender altogether, we aren't going to be addressing these kinds of norms. And I really think that if we're emphasizing more gender neutrality, then femininity and the people who express it are going to remain devalued, right? So consider, to sort of challenge some of this, I sort of posit that a way to challenge this for parents would be to do something gender non-conforming with the dolls. or the action figures. So don't necessarily take these things away, but G.I. Joe can go to the prom or get a manicure, and Barbie could win a wrestling championship. There's a lot of different things you can do, but I think challenging those gender norms in play instead of removing the gender altogether might be a better approach to going about changing some of the gendered ways that we parent our children. All right, for references, questions, comments, please email me, contact me on my website. I'm happy to send you any of the information that you learned about here. And thank you all so much. Good night.